The heavy glass door of the greenhouse shattered inward on the rainy night, and Silas dropped his tools as a 7-foot orc, glowing with a purple blight, collapsed onto his ferns. Jagged shards of glass exploded across the damp earthen floor, embedding themselves in the wooden legs of the potting benches. The colossal figure hit the ground with a heavy thud, crushing an entire bed of rare silverleaf sprouts. Silas threw his arms up to shield his face from the flying debris. The wind howled through the ruined frame, driving cold rain directly onto his soaked linen shirt. He backed away slowly, his boots crunching over the shattered remains of his entrance. The massive intruder lay face down in the dirt, her broad shoulders taking up the space of 3 normal men. A sickly purple light pulsed from deep within the ragged wounds on her thick, armor-clad back, casting a toxic neon glow over the delicate glass walls. Silas gripped the edge of his nearest work table, his knuckles turning stark white. The giant's muscular arms were splayed out awkwardly, her fingers digging deep trenches into the soft potting soil. She wore heavy leather and chainmail, now torn and heavily stained with dark blood. The purple blight crawled beneath her grayish-green skin, branching out like toxic veins along her neck. Silas grabbed a heavy iron trowel from the bench and held it out like a crude weapon. He edged closer to the fallen behemoth, his small frame dwarfed by her sheer width and height. Water dripped from her matted dark hair, pooling rapidly onto the ruined ferns and mixing with the dark blood. She let out a sudden, ragged cough, her massive chest heaving upward and snapping more stems beneath her weight. Silas flinched violently, raising the iron trowel higher as he took another hasty step back. The glowing rot spread a visible inch further down her thick bicep, illuminating the deep scars crisscrossing her jawline. The storm outside intensified, violently shaking the remaining glass panes of the greenhouse built against the ruined castle walls. Silas needed to block the wind before the temperature drop killed his delicate tropical seedlings. He skirted around the giant woman in a wide arc, keeping his eyes entirely fixed on her twitching, oversized hands. He pushed a heavy wooden crate of compressed soil across the floor, scraping it loudly against the stone foundation until it blocked the lower half of the shattered doorway. The howling wind immediately lessened, though rain still blew through the upper gap. Silas turned back to the center of the room, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. Silas hurried to the corner of the greenhouse, his wet boots slipping slightly on the slick stone path. He grabbed a heavy canvas tarp, usually meant for covering delicate blooms during the winter frosts. He dragged the stiff fabric back to the broken entrance, his thin arms straining against the heavy, wet material. He hoisted the tarp over the stacked crates, hooking the brass grommets onto the twisted metal frame of the broken door. The canvas billowed wildly inward as a strong gust of wind hit it, but it held firm, sealing out the violent storm. He secured the bottom edge with 2 heavy clay pots, panting heavily from the sudden, frantic exertion. The orc groaned loudly, a deep, guttural vibration that rattled the empty terracotta pots on the nearby shelves. Silas knelt carefully a few feet away, his knees sinking into the wet, ruined earth of the fern bed. He leaned in just close enough to inspect the pulsing, glowing wound on her shoulder. The purple rot hissed faintly as rain hit it, smelling sharply of ozone and burning leaves. It was clearly the magical blight, a lethal infection that devoured flesh and magic alike. The thick leather armor around the glowing center was charred black and dangerously brittle. The sheer heat radiating from the massive woman's body was acting like a roaring furnace against the chill of the damp air. Silas watched as a bead of thick, dark sweat rolled down her scarred cheek and dropped onto the crushed ferns. Her breathing was horribly shallow, coming in rapid, uneven hitches that rattled deep in her broad chest. He noticed a heavy, iron-studded axe strapped to her thick leather belt, its handle easily the length of his entire leg. He carefully reached out and unbuckled the weapon, sliding it away across the dirt floor so it was out of her immediate reach. His hands shook as the heavy iron scraped against the stones, but the giant woman remained motionless. Silas reached out again, his hand trembling visibly in the dim, purple-tinged light. He carefully grasped a loose, ruined flap of her leather pauldron and pulled it back to see the extent of the damage. The orc's massive muscles tensed violently under his fingertips. Her eyes snapped open in a sudden flash of movement, revealing bloodshot sclera and piercing, feral, golden irises. She let out a low, deafening growl, her massive hand shooting out with blinding speed to lock her huge, calloused fingers entirely around his wrist. Silas gasped sharply, dropping the iron trowel into the dirt as the massive, infected warrior pulled his fragile body violently down toward her face. Silas stared down at the massive, grayish-green hand wrapping entirely around his fragile wrist. The orc's grip clamped down like a heavy iron vise, grinding his thin bones together under her thick, calloused fingers. He twisted his arm violently, his boots sliding backward in the slick mud, but her hold remained unbroken. The purple glow flared intensely from her exposed shoulder, casting sharp, toxic shadows across his pale face. He stopped pulling away and leaned closer, his eyes scanning the horrifying spread of the infection along her thick collarbone. He recognized the pulsing, unnatural light immediately as the lethal, magical poison. The necrotic energy crackled faintly, eating away at the edges of her torn flesh with terrifying speed. He needed to wash the corrosive magic away before it reached her heart. Silas reached blindly with his free hand toward the base of the nearest potting bench. His fingers bumped against the cold metal of a rusted tin bucket filled with fresh rainwater. He hooked his fingers under the wire handle and dragged it forcefully across the uneven stone floor. Water sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the crushed silverleaf seedlings and soaking into the dark earth. He pulled a clean, folded linen rag from the deep pocket of his canvas apron. He plunged a cloth entirely into the freezing water, his hands shaking so badly he knocked the bucket against the stones. He wrung the wet linen out rapidly, ignoring the icy water dripping down his sleeves and soaking his cuffs. He brought the dripping cloth directly toward the pulsing, glowing rot on her massive arm. The giant woman's golden eyes narrowed sharply in the dim light. Risha shoved his chest hard with her free hand, catching him squarely on the sternum. The strike was clearly weak for a warrior of her colossal size, but it hit the fragile botanist with the force of a swinging log. Silas flew backward, his boots tangling in the heavy tarp, and crashed heavily into a tall wooden shelving unit. Empty clay pots rattled violently above him, 3 of them tumbling down to shatter around his shoulders. He gasped for air, clutching his bruised chest as he struggled to sit up among the sharp terracotta shards. The massive orc rolled onto her side, her heavy armor clanking dully against the wet floor. She pushed herself up on one shaking, tree-trunk-thick arm, her torn muscles bulging under the strain. She bared her flat, blocky teeth at him, her chest heaving as she spat a mouthful of dark blood onto the stones. She glared down at his small, crumpled form and rasped, "Don't waste your water. I am already ghosts." Her deep, guttural voice echoed loudly over the howling storm outside the broken greenhouse. Silas scrambled backward on his hands and knees, pushing the broken clay pieces out of his way. The giant warrior swayed heavily, her massive head drooping as her single supporting arm trembled violently. The purple blight flared brighter on her back, sending a visible shockwave of necrotic energy rippling under her tough skin. She weakly threatened him again by raising her heavy chin, her golden eyes flashing with a final burst of defensive fury. Then she collapsed forward with a deafening crash, her forehead striking the dirt inches from the spilled bucket of rainwater. Her golden eyes rolled back, and her colossal frame went entirely limp against the ruined fern bed. Silas froze, his back pressed tightly against the damp wooden leg of the shelving unit. The storm battered the canvas tarp, but the giant woman on the floor did not move a single muscle. He watched the toxic purple light pulsing steadily from her wounds, counting the seconds between her shallow, ragged breaths. He pushed himself up from the floor, his knees popping in the cold, damp air. He wiped the wet dirt from his palms onto his heavy apron, his eyes locked firmly on the dying behemoth. He stepped over the shattered clay pots, moving deliberately back toward the unconscious, rotting warrior. He knelt beside her massive head, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pressing his pale fingers against her thick, corded neck. Her skin burned with an unnatural, blistering fever, searing his fingertips with intense heat. The magical poison was spreading fast, the purple veins creeping visibly higher up her jawline with every passing second. Silas grabbed the wet linen rag from the dirt, shaking off the loose soil, and plunged it back into the bucket. He scrubbed furiously at the glowing edges of the wound on her arm, his small hands working with frantic, desperate speed. The toxic light hissed and steamed against the cold water, burning small holes through the coarse fabric of his rag. He threw the ruined cloth aside and grabbed a heavy pruning knife from his belt, his knuckles white as bone. He stared at the thick, charred leather straps binding her armor over the worst of the infection. He needed to cut the heavy gear off her back immediately before the magical rot consumed her spine completely. Silas stepped over the massive, unconscious orc, completely ignoring her final, breathless warning. The howling wind battered the heavy canvas tarp covering the shattered entrance, threatening to tear it loose. He grabbed a thick iron chain from the potting bench and dragged it toward the heavy wooden frame of the remaining intact door. His wet hands slipped on the cold metal links as he wrapped them tightly around the iron handles. He shoved a heavy brass padlock through the loops and snapped it shut with a loud click. He threw his entire meager weight against the reinforced wood, ensuring the barricade held firm against the violent storm outside. He spun around and sprinted down the narrow central aisle of the greenhouse, his boots splashing through puddles of cold rainwater. The glass walls rattled violently with each blast of thunder, shaking loose dead leaves from the hanging vines. He rushed past the common ferns and medicinal mosses, heading directly for the heavy glass terrariums at the very back. He grabbed a small iron pry bar from his belt and wedged it under the stuck glass lid of the main incubator. He pushed down with all his strength, his thin arms trembling until the seal broke with a sharp crack. He threw the heavy glass lid aside, completely ignoring the sharp edge that sliced a shallow cut across his palm. He thrust his hands into the humid enclosed soil, completely ignoring the sharp thorns of the surrounding flora. He violently uprooted 3 entire clusters of rare, shimmering silverleaf and a massive handful of crimson bloodroot. Dirt showered onto his damp canvas apron as he crushed the priceless, fragile stems within his desperate grip. These roots took 5 entire years to cultivate, but he ripped them from the earth without a single moment of hesitation. He tore the thick, nutrient-rich soil away from the glowing bulbs, his fingernails scraping painfully against the tough outer shells. He tossed the ruined, empty stalks onto the stone floor, his focus entirely consumed by the glowing, harvested roots. Silas ran toward his main workstation, his small, frantic steps echoing sharply against the stone floor. He dumped the handful of rare, glowing roots directly onto the scarred wooden surface of the table. He reached up to the highest shelf, his fingertips barely grazing the bottom of a heavy ceramic jar. He dragged the jar off the ledge, nearly dropping it as its sheer weight pulled his arms downward. He slammed the container onto the table and ripped off the cork stopper with his teeth. He poured a thick, dark medicinal resin over the pile of crushed roots, his hands trembling violently with cold and urgency. He grabbed a heavy stone mortar and pestle from the rack, his knuckles turning white from the tight grip. He threw the rare herbs and thick resin into the bowl, immediately grinding them down with frantic, repetitive strikes. The heavy stone pestle struck the edges of the bowl, loudly chipping the ceramic, but he did not slow his desperate pace. A pungent, burning odor filled the humid air as the crushed bloodroot mixed with the dark resin. Sweat dripped from his pale forehead, stinging his eyes as he pressed all his weight into crushing the tough plant fibers. The thick paste began to glow with a faint, pulsing blue light, reacting violently to the crushed rare roots. Silas grabbed a heavy iron kettle off the cold stove and rushed to the large rain barrel in the corner. He plunged the kettle deep into the freezing water, pulling it out filled to the absolute brim. He practically threw the heavy iron vessel back onto the stove, splashing cold water across the hot coals. He snatched a pair of iron bellows and pumped them frantically, forcing the dying embers into a roaring, bright flame. He scraped the glowing blue paste from the mortar directly into the boiling water, stirring it violently with a wooden spoon. The thick mixture bubbled aggressively, spitting hot drops of medicinal liquid onto his bare forearms and stinging his pale skin. He poured the boiling, glowing poultice into a shallow wooden bowl, his breathing ragged and entirely uneven. Silas grabbed the wooden bowl and a roll of clean linen bandages, turning back toward the ruined entrance. The colossal orc woman remained motionless on the cold stone floor, the toxic purple light still pulsing from her broad back. He dropped to his knees beside her massive head, the hard stones bruising his joints through his wet trousers. He placed the bowl of glowing poultice on the dirt, its medicinal heat radiating against his freezing hands. He reached out and grabbed the thick leather straps of her ruined armor, struggling to find the iron buckles in the dim light. He pulled a small, sharp pruning knife from his belt, gripping the wooden handle tightly. He drove the sharp blade directly into the thick, charred leather of her shoulder pauldron. He sawed frantically back and forth, the tough material resisting his small, desperate movements. The knife finally sliced through the binding, and he peeled the heavy armor away from the glowing rot. A blast of necrotic heat hit his face, smelling strongly of burnt flesh and raw magic. Silas plunged his bare fingers directly into the hot, glowing paste inside the wooden bowl, preparing to touch the lethal infection. Silas slapped the hot, glowing blue paste directly onto the necrotic purple flesh of her massive shoulder. The reaction was instantaneous and violently explosive. Thick steam hissed into the cold air, smelling sharply of ozone and boiling rot. The giant orc woman convulsed uncontrollably, her colossal frame thrashing against the wet dirt. Her heavy, grayish-green arm swept outward like a falling tree trunk, missing Silas's head by a mere fraction of an inch. He dropped the wooden bowl and threw his meager weight onto her flailing arm. His thin fingers dug desperately into her tough, scarred skin, trying to hold the giant limbs steady. Risha's blistering fever spiked, causing her massive muscles to bulge and snap underneath his grip. Silas scrambled backward and grabbed a heavy leather strap torn from her ruined armor. He looped the thick belt over her bicep and frantically tied it to the iron leg of the nearest potting bench. The heavy iron table scraped loudly across the stone floor as the massive warrior pulled against her restraints. Silas ignored the deafening screech of metal on stone and scooped another handful of the scalding medicinal mud. He pressed his pale hands forcefully into the deepest, glowing fissures of the magical blight. The thick blue paste sizzled aggressively against the toxic purple veins creeping up her neck. Risha let out a deafening, raw roar that violently rattled the surviving glass panes of the greenhouse. Silas bit his lower lip until it bled, refusing to break his contact with the seething wound. He used his precise hands to spread the coarse paste evenly, ensuring the rare roots neutralized every inch of the corruption. The toxic purple light flickered rapidly, violently clashing with the soothing blue glow of the crushed herbs. Risha bucked forcefully upward, her sheer physical strength snapping the thick leather strap entirely in half. She rolled wildly onto her side, throwing the fragile botanist completely off balance and into the mud. Silas scrambled onto his hands and knees, snatching a thick roll of coarse linen bandages from the dirt. He lunged forward, sliding beneath her swinging tree-trunk arm, and pressed the heavy cloth directly over the steaming poultice. He tightly wound the linen around her massive shoulder, pulling the knot closed with an aggressive, frantic jerk. Risha's golden eyes snapped wide open in a blind panic, and she suddenly went completely rigid. Her colossal chest ceased its rapid heaving, and Silas heard absolutely nothing over the sound of the falling rain. The pale gray light of early morning slowly pushed through the shattered glass roof of the silent greenhouse. The violent storm had finally passed, leaving only the steady, rhythmic drip of cold rainwater falling from the metal rafters onto the stone floor. Risha opened her golden eyes and stared blankly at the twisted iron framing hanging directly above her heavy head. She immediately braced her massive body for the searing, blinding agony of the magical blight, her thick jaw clenching tight. She waited for the toxic purple fire to consume her nerves. But the burning sensation was completely absent. She inhaled a deep, slow breath of the damp air, feeling her broad chest expand easily without the familiar, suffocating rattle of the rot. +2. Her thick, calloused fingers twitched cautiously in the cold mud, digging deep into the crushed remnants of the silverleaf ferns. She slowly pushed her colossal frame upward, fully expecting her infected arm to buckle and give way under her immense weight. The heavy, corded muscles of her shoulder flexed smoothly against the movement, entirely devoid of the toxic, pulsing pain. She stopped moving and stared at her massive arm, her brow furrowing deeply in the dim morning light. She reached across her broad chest and touched the thick, coarse linen bandages wrapped tightly around her bicep. The fabric was stiff with dried medicinal paste and dark, crusted blood. But the grayish-green skin underneath felt remarkably cool and solid. She turned her heavy head slowly from side to side, her thick neck popping loudly in the quiet, humid air of the ruined sanctuary. The towering warrior scanned the chaotic wreckage of broken terracotta pots, trampled soil, and ruined, rare seedlings surrounding her resting place. She noticed the heavy canvas tarp hooked securely over the shattered doorway, blocking the cold wind from entering the room. She looked down at the floor and saw the heavy iron bucket, the dark water inside stained completely red. Her gaze tracked a trail of muddy boot prints leading away from her resting spot and toward the center of the room. She followed the track with her eyes, her feral gaze sweeping past the empty potting benches and stopping abruptly. A fragile human man sat slumped over awkwardly in a small wooden chair, his chin resting heavily against his chest. His pale, spindly legs were stretched out across the damp stone path, his worn leather boots caked in wet, dark soil. His wet canvas apron was smeared with crushed green leaves, thick blue paste, and streaks of her own dark blood. Compared to her 7-foot height and enormous muscular width, the sleeping botanist looked as small and delicate as a brittle twig. His frail chest rose and fell in a slow, exhausted rhythm, completely exposed and unprotected before the massive predator waking up inches away. In his bruised, trembling hands he tightly gripped a ruined linen cloth, soaked entirely through with the remnants of her infected blood. Risha narrowed her golden eyes, her massive shoulders tensing instinctively as she searched the shadows for a hidden threat or a drawn weapon. Her superstitious clan had violently banished her to die alone in the dirt, so the magical rot would not spread to the healthy warriors. Humans from the nearby settlements always attacked her kind on sight, driving them away with heavy iron pitchforks and blazing torches. Yet this unremarkable, fragile man had locked his door, destroyed his rare plants, and fought the lethal poison all night long. The sheer, illogical reality of his actions clashed violently with every brutal survival rule burned into her tough hide. She stared intently at the bloody rag resting in his pale, bruised hands, her thick fingers curling into heavy fists. She shifted her gaze away from his hands and noticed the long, shallow cut bleeding slowly across his pale palm. She looked at the heavy iron tools hanging on the wall directly behind his vulnerable, resting head. She reached her massive right hand toward her thick leather belt, her fingers searching automatically for the familiar, heavy handle of her iron-studded axe. Her hand met empty air, and she quickly dropped her gaze to the floor, scanning the stones for her missing weapon. She spotted the massive axe resting safely against the far wall, deliberately pushed entirely out of her immediate reach. This fragile human had disarmed her, healed her, and then simply fallen asleep in a wooden chair without binding her wrists. She silently shifted her immense weight forward, planting her heavy leather boots firmly on the damp stone path. She prepared to stand up and test the full, returning strength of her massive, newly healed legs. Her heavy boots scraped harshly against a jagged, hidden shard of broken glass lying sideways in the wet mud. The sharp, grinding noise echoed loudly through the quiet greenhouse, slicing directly through the peaceful morning silence like a striking iron blade. The sleeping human jolted violently in his small wooden chair, his frail shoulders snapping upward with a sudden, breathless gasp. The bloody cloth slipped from his pale fingers and dropped with a wet, heavy slap onto the cold stone floor. Silas blinked, his exhausted eyes wide open, freezing completely as he met the intense, unblinking stare of the massive, fully conscious berserker leaning directly over his fragile body. Silas pushed himself up from the small wooden chair, his knee joints popping loudly in the damp, freezing air of the ruined greenhouse. He wiped a streak of cold sweat from his pale forehead using the back of his uninjured wrist, his chest heaving with deep, exhausted breaths. He needed to apply the remaining medicinal paste to the deep, festering wounds hidden on the colossal warrior's broad back. The massive orc woman towered over him, her enormous muscular frame entirely dwarfing his fragile, spindly stature. He reached down and grabbed the heavy wooden bowl from the wet stone floor, his pale fingers trembling violently against the rough, carved edges. The thick blue paste inside had cooled considerably overnight, but it still emitted a faint, pulsing glow in the dim morning light. Silas grabbed a clean wooden spatula from the scarred potting bench, scraping the sides of the bowl to gather every last drop of the crushed silverleaf and bloodroot resin. He stepped cautiously toward the towering behemoth, his wet leather boots splashing softly in the puddles of cold rainwater accumulating on the broken tiles. Risha instantly retreated a heavy step backward, her thick leather boots grinding harshly against the scattered, jagged shards of broken glass. She crossed her massive, tree-trunk arms protectively over her broad chest, her golden eyes narrowing into sharp, feral slits as she tracked his every meager movement. She instinctively shifted her immense weight, actively turning her scarred shoulders to completely hide her back from his line of sight. The heavy, iron-studded axe resting against the far wall caught her attention for a fraction of a second, her massive jaw clenching tightly in a display of raw, defensive tension. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, his frail shoulders hunching forward as he stared up at the imposing, hostile giant. He raised the wooden bowl slightly, gesturing with his trembling chin toward the thick, ragged tears in her ruined leather armor. Risha bared her flat, blocky teeth in a silent, menacing snarl, the heavy muscles of her thick neck bulging tightly under her grayish-green skin. She expected cruelty and violation according to the brutal traditions of her superstitious clan, entirely unused to the inexplicable, persistent kindness of this unremarkable human man. Her heavy breathing rattled deep within her massive chest, shaking the remaining glass panes in the wooden frames above their heads. Silas did not back away, nor did he lower his exhausted gaze from her fierce, bloodshot eyes. He placed the heavy wooden bowl onto the nearest surviving table, his small hands shaking as he picked up a fresh roll of coarse linen bandages. He slowly dipped his pale, bruised fingers directly into the thick, medicinal mud, scooping up a generous handful of the glowing blue resin. He held his small, coated hand up in the air, allowing the pungent, burning odor of the crushed roots to drift across the narrow space separating them. Risha flared her wide nostrils, her massive chest heaving with a sudden, uneven breath as she recognized the exact scent of the poultice that had saved her dying arm. She looked down at the thick, coarse linen bandages wrapped tightly around her bicep, her golden eyes lingering on the dried, dark blood staining the fabric. She looked back at the fragile, bruised human standing his ground with nothing but crushed leaves and trembling, unarmored hands. Silas waited silently, his bare, bleeding palm gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He shifted his meager weight from one wet boot to the other, fighting the bone-chilling cold radiating through the shattered walls of his ruined sanctuary. The towering warrior's massive shoulders suddenly slumped, a profound, heavy exhaustion replacing the defensive tension coiled tightly in her colossal frame. Risha hesitated for 15 agonizingly long seconds, her fierce, golden eyes searching his pale, bruised face for any hidden sign of treachery or malice. She uncrossed her massive arms, letting them drop heavily to her sides with a dull thud against her thick leather breeches. She let out a long, ragged exhale that completely ruffled the damp, torn collar of his canvas apron. The giant orc woman slowly, deliberately turned her massive body entirely around, completely exposing her broad back to the fragile human standing behind her. She lowered her heavy head, her dark, matted hair falling forward to expose her thick, corded neck, an absolute, unprecedented act of total submission and profound trust from a front-line berserker. Silas gasped softly, his exhausted eyes widening in sheer shock as the dim morning light illuminated the colossal expanse of her grayish-green skin. Deep black and jagged clan tattoos crisscrossed her massive, heavily muscled back in intricate, brutal geometric patterns, marking her sacred heritage and violent history. The dark ink wound entirely around the edges of the lethal, gaping wounds torn into her thick flesh, where the last remnants of the magical blight still pulsed with a sickly, fading purple light. Silas took a deliberate step forward, completely closing the final distance between his fragile frame and her towering, vulnerable back. He reached up, his small, glowing hand hovering mere inches from the sacred, marked skin of the colossal predator who had surrendered her physical defenses entirely to his precise, gentle touch. He pressed the soothing, cold, medicinal paste directly into the deepest, infected fissure of her torn flesh, his pale fingers sliding over the brutal, black ink of her sacred clan markings. A sudden, deafening crash echoed from the distant hills outside the ruined greenhouse, instantly shattering the fragile, quiet morning and sending a heavy vibration through the stone floor beneath their wet boots. 4 days passed since the violent storm shattered the main entrance of the greenhouse. Silas dragged a heavy wooden crate across the damp stone floor, his thin arms straining under the weight of the rough timber. He wedged the heavy box against the broken door frame, effectively blocking the draft coming from the ruined castle walls outside. He wiped the dirt from his pale hands onto his stained canvas apron, his breathing coming in short, uneven gasps. He turned his narrow shoulders toward the center aisle of his sanctuary. The towering, muscular warrior completely blocked the narrow pathway between the wooden potting benches. Risha stood absolutely still, her colossal 7-foot frame dwarfing the delicate glass terrarium surrounding her thick leather boots. She aggressively sought to repay her immense debt for the medicinal poultice, marching deliberately toward the heavy workbenches. The magical purple rot was entirely gone from her massive back, leaving only stark white scars cutting across her dark clan tattoos. She reached her gigantic grayish-green hand toward the edge of the nearest wooden table. Her thick, calloused fingers closed awkwardly around the thin copper handle of a small, delicate watering can. The metal handle barely fit past her first knuckles, forcing her to pinch the fragile copper violently between her massive thumb and forefinger. Silas froze in his tracks, his wet boots squeaking softly against the damp stone path. He watched intently as the massive front-line berserker lifted the tiny watering vessel high into the humid air. Risha rotated her heavy, scarred wrist with agonizing slowness, her golden eyes locked fiercely on the small metal spout. The sheer weight of her corded arm muscles made the tiny copper can tremble violently in the quiet room. She leaned her colossal torso forward, bringing her broad chest dangerously close to a hanging rack of fragile glass bulbs. Silas stepped sideways, gripping the rusted iron frame of a shelving unit, his muscles tensing to dive toward the falling glass. The giant orc woman ignored him entirely, her heavy brow furrowing deeply in raw, unbroken physical concentration. She tilted the small copper spout over a shallow wooden tray completely filled with hundreds of tiny, fragile silverleaf sproutlings. A sudden, massive rush of cold rainwater poured out of the wide nozzle, splashing violently onto the delicate green stems. A heavy stream of water blasted 3 of the tiny sprouts directly out of the dark soil, washing their fragile white roots entirely onto the wooden table. Risha violently jerked her massive hand backward, immediately cutting off the heavy flow of water. The small copper watering can slipped entirely from her thick fingers, clattering loudly against the edge of the heavy stone planter. She let out a low, frustrated growl, her heavy, blocky teeth grinding together loudly in the quiet greenhouse. Silas quickly abandoned the heavy wooden crate and hurried down the narrow stone aisle, his spindly legs carrying him swiftly past her towering, muscular legs. He reached the flooded wooden tray, his pale fingers immediately diving deep into the wet, freezing mud. He meticulously scooped up the dislodged, fragile seedlings, carefully replanting their thread-like roots back into the saturated earth. The massive warrior stepped back, her heavy boots crushing a fallen dry leaf against the cold stone floor. She crossed her thick tree-trunk arms over her broad chest, her golden eyes tracking his precise, delicate movements. Silas did not look up from the dirt, his thin shoulders hunched tightly as he packed the soil down around the microscopic green stems. He tapped the side of the wooden tray with his pale knuckles, allowing the excess water to drain out rapidly through the bottom slats. He reached out and picked up the fallen copper watering can, holding it out toward her massive, heavily scarred waist. He tapped the thin metal spout twice with his index finger, pointing directly toward a small, adjustable brass valve near the base. Risha uncrossed her heavy arms and slowly accepted the tiny vessel, her thick fingers carefully avoiding his fragile, bruised skin. She adjusted the small brass valve with the edge of her massive thumbnail, her physical movements deliberate and painfully slow. She stepped back toward the wooden tray, her colossal shadow completely covering the fragile sproutlings and the frail botanist. She tilted the copper watering can again, her heavy muscles locking rigidly into place to completely stop the violent trembling. A perfectly fine, gentle mist sprayed evenly from the spout, delicately coating the remaining green leaves in tiny, glittering droplets. Silas wiped his muddy hands on his canvas apron, a small, subtle dropping of his rigid shoulders acting as his only physical response. He turned entirely away from the massive warrior, moving down the damp stone path toward the humid, glass-enclosed terrariums at the very back of the room. He grabbed his heavy iron pruning shears from his leather belt, the cold metal heavy in his pale, bruised grip. He stopped abruptly in front of a shattered glass incubator, the sharp edges of the broken pane glinting violently in the pale afternoon light. A highly rare, crimson-veined orchid sat crookedly inside a cracked terracotta pot, its thick roots bulging aggressively through the broken clay. The fragile plant required immediate transfer to a larger, reinforced wooden box, or its exposed roots would completely wither in the damp chill. Silas reached his small, trembling hands toward the sharp, broken edges of the shattered clay pot to begin the dangerous extraction. A massive, grayish-green hand suddenly reached directly over his narrow shoulder, completely blocking his physical path to the delicate flower. Risha pushed his frail body aside with a single, light touch of her thick knuckles, her fierce golden eyes locking dead onto the fragile, trapped orchid. Risha's massive, grayish-green fingers hovered mere millimeters above the jagged rim of the shattered terracotta pot, holding the crimson-veined orchid. Silas froze entirely, his pale hands dropping slowly to his sides, as the colossal warrior completely blocked his path to the delicate flower. He watched her thick, calloused thumb gently trace the sharp edge of the broken clay, her heavy breathing slowing to a deep, controlled rhythm. She did not reach for the heavy iron pruning shears resting on the nearby wooden table, instead lowering her colossal frame until she crouched directly at eye level with the fragile plant. The heavy leather joints of her armor creaked loudly in the quiet greenhouse, the sound echoing sharply against the damp glass walls. She carefully slid her massive index finger into the cracked soil, her flat, blocky teeth clenching tightly as she focused entirely on the microscopic roots. The giant orc woman pushed her thick fingernail against the internal curve of the broken clay, applying an impossibly calculated, microscopic amount of pressure. A sharp, distinct crack snapped through the humid air as the remaining terracotta cleanly split into 3 even pieces, falling away from the dense root ball without disturbing the soil. Silas leaned his small, fragile torso forward, his wet leather boots remaining firmly planted on the cold stone floor to avoid startling the towering behemoth. Risha slid both of her enormous, scarred hands directly under the exposed, dark earth, her heavy wrists locking rigidly to prevent any sudden, violent shaking. She lifted the entire delicate orchid upward in one smooth, continuous motion, entirely suspending the fragile plant between her gigantic palms. The intricate, thread-like roots dangled completely unharmed from the bottom of the soil block, fully exposed to the cold, damp air of the ruined sanctuary. She slowly pivoted her massive shoulders, turning her colossal body toward the heavy wooden planter box resting on the adjacent scarred work table. Her heavy leather boots scraped softly against the loose gravel, but her heavily muscled arms remained completely motionless, holding the orchid as steadily as a stone statue. Silas held his own shallow breath, his exhausted eyes tracking the fragile crimson vines brushing lightly against her thick, dark clan tattoos. Risha lowered the heavy root ball directly into the center of the reinforced wooden box, her thick knuckles scraping harshly against the rough timber siding. She slowly pulled her gigantic hands away from the dark soil, leaving the delicate flower perfectly upright in its new, spacious container. She did not crush a single leaf or snap a single fragile stem during the entire heavy transfer. Silas let out a long, shuddering exhale, his narrow shoulders suddenly dropping 2 full inches as the intense physical tension completely left his fragile frame. He stepped cautiously around the massive warrior, dragging a heavy canvas sack of nutrient-rich potting soil across the damp stone floor. He reached his pale, bruised hand directly beside her massive grayish-green arm and scooped a large handful of the dark earth into the empty spaces of the wooden box. The towering, front-line berserker watched his small, precise movements closely, her golden eyes tracking the dirt falling softly over the exposed roots. Silas packed the soil down gently with his thin fingertips, ensuring the fragile plant sat securely in the center of the heavy container. He stepped back from the wooden table, wiped his dirty hands on his torn canvas apron, and offered her a small, undeniable smile. Risha stared blankly at the fragile human's subtle expression, her massive brow furrowing deeply in the pale, filtered afternoon light. She looked down at her own enormous scarred hands, spreading her thick fingers wide to expose the heavy calluses and thick, dark dirt packed tightly under her nails. She turned her colossal palms upward, tracing the deep, jagged scars cutting across her grayish-green skin, where she had previously held heavy iron axes and broken shields. A delicate crimson flower stood perfectly intact beside her heavy arm, its thin vines completely undamaged by her overwhelming, brutal physical strength. She closed her thick fingers into slow, deliberate fists, her massive jaw loosening entirely as she stared at the transplanted, living roots. Her heavy chest heaved with a deep, silent breath as she physically registered that her destructive hands possessed the exact capacity to carefully nurture fragile life. Silas reached across the wooden bench, his pale fingers wrapping around the thin copper handle of the small watering can she had used just moments before. He lifted the tiny vessel and tilted the brass spout directly over the dark, freshly packed soil surrounding the crimson-veined orchid. A steady, gentle stream of cold rainwater flowed from the nozzle, quickly soaking into the dry dirt and completely settling the heavy dust in the wooden box. Risha stood absolutely frozen beside him, her colossal 7-foot frame casting a massive, dark shadow entirely over his frail, trembling shoulders. She watched the water pool briefly on the surface before draining deep into the earth, feeding the microscopic root system she had just meticulously saved from destruction. Silas dragged a small wooden stool toward the back wall of the greenhouse, his wet leather boots scraping harshly against the damp stone floor. He sat down heavily under the largest intact section of the sloped glass roof, his frail shoulders hunching forward as he grabbed a thick, cracked terracotta pot from the lower shelf. The towering orc woman followed his path down the narrow aisle, her massive leather boots shaking the wooden benches with every heavy step. Risha lowered her colossal 7-foot frame onto the thick stone edge of the raised planting bed, her broad shoulders completely blocking the pale light filtering through the damp glass. She crossed her tree-trunk arms over her massive chest, her golden eyes tracking the precise movements of his pale, bruised hands. Silas placed the cracked clay pot onto his lap, his thin fingers digging into the dry, hard dirt packed tightly around a twisted gray root system. He pulled a heavy iron trowel from his canvas apron, the metal handle looking like a tiny silver twig against the backdrop of her immense, heavily scarred torso. Silas wedged the sharp tip of the iron trowel directly into the dry dirt, pressing his meager weight down on the handle to split the dense soil. The hard earth cracked loudly, exposing a thick, tangled mass of pale roots completely choked inside the confined space of the small pot. He dropped the heavy iron tool onto the stone floor and used his bare thumbs to forcefully rip the bottom half of the root ball entirely off. A sharp, tearing sound echoed in the quiet, humid air, as the dead, brittle fibers snapped under his deliberate physical pressure. The massive warrior leaned her heavy torso forward, her thick brow furrowing deeply as she watched the fragile human intentionally damage the living plant. She uncrossed her thick arms, her enormous hands resting heavily on her thick leather knee pads, completely silent as she observed his destructive, precise actions. Silas pulled a wide, reinforced wooden box toward his knees, dumping a heavy pile of dark, nutrient-rich soil directly over the freshly torn roots. Silas packed the wet earth down firmly around the surviving green stem, his pale fingers working the soft soil deep into the violently torn base. He looked up from the wooden box, his exhausted eyes meeting the fierce, golden gaze of the colossal front-line berserker towering above his small wooden stool. He pointed his dirt-stained index finger directly at the broken, discarded roots scattered across the damp stone tiles. He stated clearly that a plant left in a tight pot will eventually choke on its own tangled roots and completely die. Sitting under the glass roof, Silas explained that some plants need to be violently broken and repotted into fresh earth to grow stronger. He dragged his heavy canvas sleeve across his pale forehead, leaving a dark smear of wet mud right above his right eyebrow. He added that the violent tearing strictly forces the remaining roots to spread wider and anchor much deeper into the new dirt. Risha stared intently at the violently torn roots resting on the cold stone floor, her heavy jaw clenching tightly in the dim afternoon light. Her massive, grayish-green shoulders slumped slightly, the thick leather armor creaking loudly against her broad, scarred back. She reached down and picked up a single, snapped, white root with her thick, calloused fingers, completely rolling the fragile fiber between her massive thumb and forefinger. She turned her fierce golden eyes toward the shattered glass wall of the greenhouse, staring entirely past the damp ferns and into the darkening horizon. She quietly related this physical destruction directly to her own brutal exile from her superstitious people. "My clan cut me from the earth and threw me onto the rocks to rot alone," she stated, her deep, guttural voice rumbling heavily in her broad chest. She dropped the broken root back onto the damp stone path, her heavy muscles tensing slowly as she added, "But this new dirt does not burn my skin." Silas nodded slowly, his pale hands wiping the thick, wet mud onto his ruined canvas apron. He reached down to grab his fallen iron trowel, his thin fingers wrapping securely around the cold metal handle. A sudden, sharp flicker of unnatural bright orange light instantly pierced through the damp, shattered glass of the far eastern wall. Silas snapped his head upward, his exhausted eyes widening in sheer shock as he stared through the heavy condensation dripping down the glass panes. Torches appeared clearly on the crest of the distant muddy hill, the bright flames cutting aggressively through the fading twilight. The villagers had seen the unnatural purple glow of the fading magical blight, and were now coming with fire to burn the perceived infection from the land. Angry shouts began to echo faintly but rapidly approaching the fragile glass walls, completely shattering the quiet sanctuary of the greenhouse. Silas rushed toward the eastern glass wall, his pale hands wiping the cold condensation off the damp panes. His canvas apron snagged on the rusted corner of a wooden bench, but he ignored the tearing fabric as he pressed his frail face directly against the freezing glass. Torches appeared clearly on the crest of the distant muddy hill, their bright orange flames cutting through the fog settling over the valley. The flickering light cast shaking shadows across the ruined stone courtyard outside his fragile sanctuary. He squinted his exhausted eyes, his thin chest heaving as he counted 24 fires moving steadily down the steep path. The local villagers had seen the unnatural purple glow of the fading magical blight during the storm, and were now coming to burn the infection directly from the land. Silas gripped the rusted iron frame of the glass wall, his knuckles turning white as the cold metal dug into his bruised palms. He watched the iron-tipped pitchforks and wooden clubs catching the erratic firelight, the crude weapons swinging with every marching step of the approaching crowd. He knew these farmers forcefully eradicated any trace of magical corruption, and they carried enough pitch to reduce his life's work to gray ash. Silas pushed himself away from the freezing glass, his wet boots slipping against the damp stone floor as he lost his balance. He crashed into the edge of a wooden table, his frail hip taking the impact, but he scrambled instantly back to his feet. He spun his narrow shoulders around, his frantic gaze scanning the fragile glass terrariums, the delicate hanging vines, and the rare seedlings filling the humid air. The towering orc woman stepped out of the shadows of the central aisle, her thick leather boots shaking the wooden benches with a dull thud. Risha turned her heavily muscled neck toward the eastern wall, her fierce golden eyes locking instantly onto the advancing line of orange fire creeping closer to the ruined castle walls. The violent light illuminated the stark white scars cutting across the dark clan tattoos on her grayish-green face. She flared her wide nostrils, inhaling deeply as the acrid smell of burning pine pitch and dry leaves penetrated the broken gaps in the greenhouse roof. She recognized exactly what the approaching fire meant, her heavy jaw clenching tightly as the brutal memory of her own violent banishment flooded back into her immediate focus. Silas sprinted frantically down the narrow stone path, his spindly legs carrying him rapidly toward the wooden barricade he had built against the shattered main entrance. He grabbed a thick iron chain resting on the nearest table, his small hands trembling as he dragged the metal links across the rough timber boards. The front-line berserker watched his clumsy movements, her huge arms dropping to her sides as the reality of the incoming threat settled onto her armored shoulders. Silas wrapped the cold iron chain repeatedly around the wooden frame, pulling the metal taut before snapping a brass padlock through the final iron loop. He threw his meager weight against the reinforced door, his frail shoulders striking the solid wood to test the barricade. The timber held firm against his frantic push, but the fragile glass walls surrounding the structure offered absolutely zero physical defense against a mob heavily armed with stones and blazing torches. Risha took a deliberate step forward, her immense 7-foot frame towering over the crimson-veined orchid she had just transplanted into the wooden box. She reached her calloused right hand directly toward the cold stone wall, her fingers wrapping tightly around the long, leather-wrapped handle of her iron-studded axe. She lifted the weapon effortlessly from the ground, the iron blade scraping against the loose gravel and throwing a shower of bright orange sparks into the damp air. Silas turned away from the chained door, his exhausted eyes widening in panic as he saw the fully armed berserker readying her lethal weapon right in the middle of his sanctuary. He rushed back toward the center of the room, raising his pale, empty hands defensively in front of his narrow chest. The orange glow of the torches suddenly illuminated the entire eastern half of the greenhouse, washing out the pale moonlight and casting a terrifying, fiery hue over the damp ferns. The villagers reached the bottom of the muddy valley, their boots tramping loudly through the thick brush separating the settlement from the castle grounds. Silas stood directly in front of the orc, his small frame trembling as the harsh, flickering light exposed every dark bruise on his exhausted face. He grabbed the heavy iron pruning shears from his worn leather belt, gripping the cold metal handles tightly to arm himself with the only tool he possessed. The loud sound of snapping tree branches and marching footsteps echoed sharply through the quiet air, growing louder with every passing second. Risha lowered the head of her axe toward the stone floor, her golden eyes fixed entirely on the thick smoke slowly rising beyond the eastern wall. The leading villager raised a burning branch high into the dark sky, the fire brightly illuminating the jagged edges of the shattered roof. A sudden, chaotic chorus of marching footsteps halted abruptly outside the thin glass panes, surrounding the fragile building in a tight ring of crackling fire. Angry shouts echoed immediately outside the fragile glass walls, completely shattering the quiet sanctuary of the greenhouse. Silas spun his narrow shoulders away from the chained door, his wet boots sliding across the damp tiles. He dropped his iron pruning shears onto the nearby wooden bench, his pale hands trembling in the freezing air. He sprinted down the central stone aisle, his spindly legs carrying his frail frame rapidly past the hanging ferns. The bright orange light of 20 blazing torches pierced aggressively through the eastern panes, casting massive shadows across the dark earth. A heavy wooden club slammed against the exterior stone foundation, vibrating through the damp floorboards and directly into the soles of his worn leather boots. The colossal orc woman stood absolutely still in the center of the ruined building, her enormous 7-foot frame bathed in the violent firelight. Risha turned her massive head toward the loudest voices, her fierce golden eyes narrowing instantly into sharp slits. She gripped the leather-wrapped handle of her iron-studded axe, her gigantic knuckles turning pale under the immense physical pressure. Silas abandoned his frantic sprint and grabbed a heavy canvas tarp resting on the wet dirt floor. He dragged the stiff fabric across the narrow pathway, his frail chest heaving continuously with rapid, shallow gasps. He threw the heavy material directly over a row of delicate saplings, desperately attempting to shield the fragile leaves from the impending destruction. The towering warrior lowered the head of her weapon until the cold iron blade rested silently against the damp stone path. She watched the fragile human strain violently against a tall oak shelving unit resting against the southern wall. Silas shoved his meager weight directly against the solid wood, his thin boots slipping repeatedly in the slick mud. He gritted his flat teeth and pushed aggressively again, his pale face turning bright red as he tried to slide the structure in front of the exposed glass. The angry voices outside multiplied rapidly, merging into a deafening roar, calling loudly for the immediate eradication of the unnatural infection. A heavy rock suddenly struck the sloped glass roof with a deafening crack, sending a shower of jagged shards raining down onto the crushed soil. Silas threw his bruised hands instinctively over his pale head, dropping entirely to his fragile knees to completely avoid the falling glass debris. Risha did not flinch, her broad shoulders effortlessly deflecting a sharp piece of broken pane entirely away from her exposed neck. She uncurled her thick fingers completely from her weapon, allowing the heavy iron-studded axe to fall backward onto the loose gravel with a loud crash. She stepped deliberately over the fallen iron tool, her massive leather boots crushing the scattered terracotta fragments into fine dust on the stone floor. She closed the distance between her towering torso and his kneeling frame in 2 massive strides, completely blocking the harsh firelight from his terrified face. Risha reached her enormous right hand downward, her calloused fingers wrapping gently around his shivering bicep. She pulled him effortlessly to his feet, her overwhelming physical strength easily lifting his entire meager weight completely off the wet stone floor. She released his fragile arm instantly, crossing her thick arms firmly over her broad chest. Risha looked directly down into his wide, exhausted eyes, her heavy jaw locking rigidly into place in the dim light. She told Silas in a deep, unwavering voice to open the heavy iron chain and give her completely to the violent, waiting mob. She gestured with her massive chin toward the fragile crimson-veined orchid and the hundreds of newly planted seedlings filling the humid air. She stated clearly that his life's work would be utterly destroyed by the raging fire if they found a living orc hiding behind the delicate glass. Her commanding words echoed heavily over the chaotic, violent shouting completely surrounding the fragile walls of the ruined greenhouse. She deliberately turned her broad, heavily scarred back toward the chained main entrance, entirely surrendering her defensive posture to the fragile human botanist. Silas stared blankly at the colossal front-line berserker, offering her own life to permanently save his cultivated plants. His pale hands clenched aggressively into tight fists at his sides, his short fingernails digging painfully deep into the skin of his own palms. Another exceptionally heavy stone smashed forcefully through the eastern wall, completely shattering a massive glass pane and letting the freezing wind violently rush inside. The sudden, violent draft instantly extinguished 3 of the small oil lanterns dangling from the rusted iron rafters directly above their heads. The bright, highly destructive fire of a thrown torch sailed perfectly through the newly broken window, spinning rapidly through the freezing night air. The burning wood landed directly in the center of a dry, highly flammable pile of imported peat moss resting on a wooden potting bench. The dry fibers erupted instantly into a towering, bright yellow flame, the intense heat rapidly spreading directly toward the heavy wooden support beams of the entire structure. The towering pillar of bright yellow fire erupted from the dry peat moss, instantly casting a violent, flickering heat against the damp glass walls of the greenhouse. Silas did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second, entirely ignoring the colossal orc woman's heavy demand to surrender herself to the violent mob. He spun his fragile shoulders away from her towering, heavily scarred frame and lunged desperately toward the roaring flames. His worn leather boots slipped dangerously on the wet stone tiles, his narrow chest heaving with sharp, panicked gasps as the acrid smoke rapidly filled the humid air. He reached the heavy wooden potting bench, his pale hands frantically grabbing a massive, reinforced canvas sack completely filled with damp, heavy potting soil. He hoisted the heavy bag with a sudden, violent jerk, his spindly arms shaking uncontrollably under the sheer, crushing weight of the saturated earth. He swung the heavy canvas sack directly over the burning pile of imported peat moss, completely ripping the rough fabric open with his bare, bruised fingers. The thick, wet black dirt crashed heavily down onto the bright yellow flames, instantly smothering the highest peak of the fire and sending a massive, blinding cloud of thick gray steam rapidly expanding into the freezing night air. The intense, boiling heat radiated sharply against his pale face, violently singing the delicate tips of his dark eyelashes and leaving a thick streak of black soot heavily smeared across his left cheek. Silas coughed violently, his fragile torso doubling over as the thick, choking smoke forcefully invaded his burning lungs. He dropped the ruined canvas sack onto the stone floor and blindly grabbed a rusted iron bucket sitting near the edge of the heavy table. He plunged the heavy metal container directly into the large rain barrel, pulling it out completely full of freezing dark water. He hurled the heavy liquid aggressively over the remaining embers, the cold water loudly hissing and violently popping as it completely killed the immediate threat to the wooden support beams. Risha stood absolutely motionless in the center of the narrow stone aisle, her fierce golden eyes wide with sheer, unprecedented shock. She watched the fragile, completely unarmed human blatantly risk his own delicate life to aggressively fight the destructive fire, instead of simply handing her over to the angry villagers outside. The heavy leather joints of her armor creaked loudly as her massive, heavily muscled chest expanded with a deep, shuddering breath. The deafening roar of the violent mob outside grew significantly louder, completely surrounding the fragile, shattered glass walls with terrifying hostility. Another heavy rock smashed forcefully through a high glass pane, sending a dangerous shower of razor-sharp shards falling directly toward Silas's unprotected form. The towering front-line berserker moved with blinding speed, her massive 7-foot frame crossing the damp stone floor in 2 gigantic strides. She aggressively shoved Silas completely under the heavy wooden potting bench, her thick hands knocking him safely out of the direct path of the falling debris. The sharp glass shards bounced harmlessly off her incredibly thick shoulders and her tough leather armor, completely failing to pierce her immensely durable skin. She reached her enormous right hand down to the wet gravel and forcefully grabbed the long handle of her heavy iron-studded axe. She lifted the massive weapon effortlessly with a single arm, the cold iron blade gleaming menacingly in the flickering orange light of the exterior torches. She did not turn her broad back to the shattered entrance to surrender. Instead, she stepped aggressively forward, entirely placing her towering mass directly between the fragile human and the broken eastern wall. The freezing winter wind howled violently through the jagged hole in the shattered glass, blowing stinging ash and freezing rain directly into her fierce face. The leading members of the violent mob finally reached the very edge of the ruined stone foundation. Their heavy wooden clubs and iron-tipped pitchforks raised aggressively high into the dark sky. They expected to find a dying monster crippled by the lethal magical blight, entirely ready to be slaughtered. Instead, the bright orange light of their blazing torches perfectly illuminated the towering silhouette of a fully healed, heavily armed orc berserker staring directly down at their frail bodies. Risha bared her flat, blocky teeth in a raw, deafening roar that violently shook the remaining glass panes and echoed terrifyingly deep into the muddy valley. The overwhelming acoustic force of her aggressive battle cry forcefully hit the front line of the angry villagers, freezing them in their muddy tracks. The chaotic shouting of the mob instantly died completely away, rapidly replaced by the terrifying silence of overwhelming primal fear. The leading farmer lowered his blazing torch, his hands shaking violently as he stared in pure horror at the massive white scars cleanly cutting across her dark clan tattoos, proving the lethal magical infection was impossibly gone. Risha slammed the heavy iron blade of her massive axe aggressively against the solid stone foundation, the deafening crash throwing a brilliant shower of bright orange sparks into the freezing wind. She firmly held her completely defensive position to strictly protect the delicate sanctuary and the fragile human hiding directly beneath the wooden bench behind her. Silas carefully pushed himself out from under the heavy wooden table, his pale hands pressing firmly against the damp stone floor to support his entirely exhausted weight. He wiped the thick ash from his bruised forehead, his chest heaving as he stared up at the colossal wall of grayish-green muscle standing firmly between him and the immediate threat. He slowly reached his trembling hand forward, his pale fingers gently grazing the thick leather straps binding the heavy armor on the back of her massive calf. Risha felt the feather-light, non-threatening touch, and the extreme tension tightly coiled within her colossal frame subtly shifted. She did not lower her heavy weapon, but the aggressive rumble in her broad chest slowly settled into a steady, warning growl. The violent mob of fearful villagers slowly began to back away from the ruined stone foundation, their heavy boots stumbling backwards through the thick brush. The sheer reality of facing a fully conscious, completely uninjured orc warrior in close combat rapidly shattered their fiery resolve. One by one, the bright orange torches began to rapidly retreat down the muddy hill, the cowardly flames quickly disappearing back into the thick fog settling heavily over the dark valley. Risha watched the very last flickering light completely fade from the distant horizon, her golden eyes never breaking their intense vigil over the shattered eastern wall. She finally lowered the heavy iron head of her massive axe to the wet stone floor, her heavy breath pluming in thick white clouds in the freezing, ruined air of the quiet sanctuary. The freezing winter wind continued to howl violently through the jagged hole in the shattered eastern glass wall, forcefully blowing stinging ash and cold rain directly into the ruined greenhouse. Risha remained absolutely motionless facing the dark valley, her colossal 7-foot frame standing as a rigid barricade between the fragile sanctuary and the retreating villagers. She gripped the leather-wrapped handle of her heavy, iron-studded axe with immense physical pressure, her thick knuckles turning stark white as she aggressively tracked the fading sparks of the distant torches. The chaotic shouting of the hostile mob was completely replaced by the rhythmic dripping of cold rainwater falling from the broken roof onto the scattered terracotta shards. Silas remained leaning heavily against the damp stone foundation, his frail chest heaving with rapid gasps as the thick, acrid smoke from the burnt peat moss dissipated. He pressed his bruised hands flat against the cold stone floor, his spindly arms shaking uncontrollably as he desperately pushed his entirely exhausted weight upright. His worn leather boots slipped twice on the wet gravel before he finally managed to stand, his fragile knees buckling slightly under the intense physical strain. Risha slowly turned her massive, heavily scarred neck toward the center of the narrow stone aisle, her fierce golden eyes locking onto the fragile botanist's trembling, soot-stained form. She deliberately lowered the heavy iron head of her massive axe, letting the cold metal blade rest silently against the damp dirt to signal the end of the immediate threat. She reached her enormous left hand toward her right shoulder, her calloused fingers aggressively tracing a deep indentation smashed into her tough leather pauldron. The heavy stone thrown by the angry villagers had struck her massive shoulder with enough brute force to instantly kill a fragile human, but her dense body absorbed the violent impact completely. Silas stumbled forward, his wet leather boots loudly crunching over the thick layer of shattered glass, completely covering the main pathway of his ruined sanctuary. He reached the heavy wooden potting bench and grabbed a clean linen rag, violently coughing a dark, soot-filled substance into the coarse fabric. He aggressively wiped the thick black ash from his pale forehead and bruised cheeks, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from the freshly singed tips of his dark eyelashes. Silas dropped the ruined rag onto the wet dirt and turned his narrow shoulders toward the heavily damaged eastern wall, his exhausted eyes scanning the extensive structural destruction. The massive hole in the fragile glass left his entire collection of highly sensitive, rare tropical seedlings completely exposed to the lethal, freezing temperature of the winter night. He rapidly crossed the damp stone floor, aggressively grabbing an incredibly thick roll of heavy canvas fabric stored beneath the rusted iron shelving unit. He forcefully hauled the heavy roll upward, his spindly arms straining violently against the sheer, crushing weight of the dense, water-resistant material. He dragged the heavy canvas directly toward the shattered window frame, his pale face turning bright red as he expended the very last reserves of his physical strength. Risha stepped completely away from her defensive position, her massive leather boots shaking the wooden benches as she closed the distance between them in 2 gigantic strides. She reached her enormous hands directly over his trembling shoulders, easily lifting the massive roll of heavy canvas entirely out of his weak, failing grip. The towering frontline berserker hoisted the heavy fabric high into the freezing air, unrolling the thick canvas with a single flick of her immensely powerful wrists. She physically pressed the dense material flat against the splintered oak frame of the shattered window, completely blocking the violent wind from entering the humid sanctuary. Silas gasped sharply as he quickly reached into the deep front pocket of his torn, mud-stained canvas apron. He pulled out a handful of heavy iron nails and a sturdy wooden hammer, his pale fingers trembling so violently that 2 thick nails slipped from his grasp and clattered against the tiles. He stepped up beside her colossal frame, awkwardly raising the heavy hammer to secure the thick canvas directly to the solid oak framing. He struck the head of the first iron nail with a clumsy, off-center blow, the heavy wooden hammer violently slipping and smashing directly against his pale, unprotected thumb. Silas dropped the heavy tool instantly, heavily biting his lower lip to suppress a sharp cry of pain as a dark purple bruise rapidly blossomed under his fingernail. Risha did not look away from the heavy canvas she held firmly against the splintered wooden frame, but her massive jaw clenched tightly in the dim moonlight. She slowly extended her heavily scarred right hand toward the wet stone floor, her enormous fingers effortlessly scooping up the fallen hammer and the scattered iron nails. She pinched a thick iron nail exactly between her massive thumb and forefinger, perfectly aligning the sharp metal tip directly against the dense canvas. She swung the heavy hammer with short, incredibly precise strikes, forcefully driving the thick iron nails deep into the hard wood without causing a single unnecessary vibration. She rapidly moved along the entire perimeter of the shattered window frame, her massive muscles flexing smoothly in the cold air as she completely sealed the gaping hole. The howling sound of the freezing wind was instantly cut off, replacing the chaotic noise of the winter storm with the absolute silence of the fully enclosed sanctuary. She tossed the wooden hammer onto the nearest potting bench, the heavy tool landing with a dull thud perfectly beside Silas's abandoned iron pruning shears. Silas stood absolutely still, his uninjured hand tightly cradling his bruised, throbbing thumb directly against his narrow, heaving chest. He stared silently at the perfectly secured barricade, recognizing the overwhelming physical precision the colossal warrior had just flawlessly demonstrated with his delicate tools. He turned his exhausted gaze away from the sealed window, carefully inspecting the violently soaked, completely blackened pile of imported peat moss resting heavily on the main table. He plunged his uninjured fingers directly into the freezing mud, aggressively sifting through the dark earth to ensure not a single ember remained alive beneath the surface. Risha stepped back into the central stone aisle, her massive leather boots avoiding the fragile, recovering seedlings she had meticulously watered earlier that afternoon. She looked down at the fragile human methodically digging through the wet ash, her fierce golden eyes tracking the precise, desperate movements of his soot-stained hands. "They will not return, for they fear the healed flesh significantly more than the rotting disease," she stated, her deep, guttural voice rumbling heavily in her broad chest. Silas pushed himself upright from the soaked, blackened pile of imported peat moss. He wiped his soot-stained hands heavily against the coarse canvas of his torn apron, leaving thick, dark streaks across the rough fabric. His narrow chest heaved with shallow gasps as the sharp pain in his bruised thumb radiated up his spindly forearm. The howling winter wind outside remained blocked by the heavy canvas barricade, leaving the ruined sanctuary in heavy silence. Risha turned her massive neck away from the sealed window frame, her fierce, golden eyes scanning the physical destruction scattered across the wet stone floor. She reached her enormous left hand toward her right shoulder, her calloused fingers gripping the leather strap of her damaged pauldron. The heavy iron buckle snapped loudly in the quiet air as she forcefully tore the ruined armor piece entirely off her broad back. She dropped the thick leather directly onto the loose gravel, the material landing with a dull thud right next to Silas's wet boots. Silas flinched at the sudden noise, his eyes dropping to the shattered terracotta pots and crushed seedlings covering the central stone aisle. He dropped rapidly onto his fragile knees, his wet trousers soaking instantly in the freezing mud on the damp tiles. He reached his pale fingers into the jagged pile of broken clay, tossing the sharp shards aside to uncover the fragile green stems buried underneath. A heavy drop of cold condensation fell from the surviving glass roof, landing perfectly on the back of his shivering neck. He ignored the freezing water, his thin hands working with frantic speed to pull 3 intact silverleaf sprouts from the wet dirt. He placed the fragile roots into a clean wooden tray resting on the lowest shelf of an intact potting bench. The towering frontline berserker watched his rapid movements from the center of the narrow stone pathway. Risha stepped heavily forward, her thick leather boots crunching over the scattered glass fragments and grinding them into fine white dust. She stopped directly in front of a massive oak shelving unit, violently toppled across the main aisle during the chaotic attack. The heavy structure blocked Silas's direct physical access to the large iron rain barrel resting in the far corner. Silas abandoned his wooden tray and grabbed the edge of the fallen oak frame, his pale knuckles turning stark white as he threw his meager weight against the solid timber. His wet boots slipped backward in the slick mud, his frail shoulders failing to move the waterlogged furniture even a single inch. Risha reached her gigantic hands directly over his trembling shoulders, wrapping her thick fingers firmly around the thickest wooden beams. She easily pushed his fragile body aside with a single touch of her massive hip, taking over the heavy physical labor. She locked her heavy arm muscles and violently jerked the entire oak shelving unit off the wet stone floor in one smooth motion. She rotated her scarred shoulders effortlessly, setting the heavy wooden frame upright against the intact southern stone foundation. The structure settled into the deep dirt with a loud crunch, clearing the central pathway. Silas stood absolutely still, his spindly arms hanging loosely at his sides. He stepped forward to grab a rusted iron bucket resting beside the large rain barrel. He plunged the heavy metal container deep into the freezing water, his pale hands shaking so violently that cold liquid splashed over the rim and soaked his freezing trousers. He dragged the full bucket toward the surviving ferns, his narrow shoulders hunching heavily under the sheer weight. Risha stepped entirely out of his path, her massive torso pressing firmly against the wooden potting bench to give him maximum physical space. She watched his frail chest heave as he hurled cold water over the ash-covered leaves of his oldest plants. The thick, gray soot washed away from the vibrant green foliage, the dirty water draining into the deep mud. The pale light of early dawn began to push through the condensation covering the surviving glass roof. The violent orange glow of the distant torches was gone, replaced by the cold, gray illumination of the winter morning. Risha turned her massive head toward the small wooden stool overturned near the back wall, her golden eyes tracking a small, intact terracotta pot resting safely beneath the wooden legs. She walked heavily toward the back of the greenhouse, her colossal frame casting a long shadow over the damp stone path. She reached her enormous right hand down and pinched the rim of the small clay pot perfectly between her massive thumb and thick forefinger. She lifted the container off the freezing ground, her heavy brow furrowing as she closely inspected the undamaged, tiny green sprout growing directly in the center of the dark earth. She carried the fragile plant back toward the main workstation, her heavy boots avoiding the wet mud puddles Silas had just created. She gently placed the small terracotta pot directly onto the scarred wooden surface, her destructive hands moving with absolute physical precision to avoid jarring the fragile soil. Silas dropped his heavy iron bucket onto the stone floor, the metal handle clattering against the rusted rim. He braced his exhausted hands firmly against the edge of the heavy table, his spindly legs violently trembling as the intense adrenaline finally left his frail body. He coughed heavily, a dark streak of black soot covering his pale chin. The colossal orc woman stood silent directly beside his trembling form, her huge, muscular arms resting loosely at her sides without a single trace of her former defensive tension. She ignored her heavy axe lying abandoned on the wet stone floor, her golden eyes remaining entirely fixed on the fragile, living things surrounding her massive body. The cold, pale light of the early winter morning fully breached the shattered eastern wall, illuminating the extensive physical destruction scattered across the damp stone floor. Silas gripped the worn wooden handle of a small, stiff-bristled broom, his pale knuckles turning stark white as he aggressively swept the jagged shards of broken glass into a large pile. The sharp fragments scraped loudly against the wet terracotta tiles, echoing sharply through the quiet, ruined sanctuary. The towering orc woman did not stand idle, her colossal 7-foot frame bending completely in half as she reached her enormous hands directly toward the loose gravel. Risha ignored the sharp edges of the destroyed panes, her thick fingers easily scooping massive handfuls of the broken glass directly from the freezing mud. She dumped the heavy debris into a reinforced wooden crate, the sharp glass clattering violently against the solid timber siding without leaving a single scratch on her grayish-green skin. They worked together in absolute, unbroken silence, methodically clearing the narrow central pathway of the heavy wreckage left behind by the violent siege. Silas dragged his small broom heavily across the wet stone floor, his spindly legs shaking slightly under the sheer physical exhaustion of the grueling night. He focused entirely on gathering the microscopic splinters of glass completely hidden within the dark soil, his thin shoulders hunching forward with every deliberate stroke. The massive frontline berserker moved with agonizingly slow, calculated precision, directly beside his fragile frame, her enormous leather boots carefully stepping over the surviving green vines. She lifted shattered wooden table legs and massive chunks of broken terracotta pots, throwing the destroyed materials into a separate corner of the room. The physical contrast between his weak sweeps and her overwhelming brute strength dominated the space, yet their efforts synchronized to completely restore the fragile environment. Risha abruptly stopped her heavy labor, her thick fingers freezing halfway toward another large shard of glass resting near the intact back wall. She slowly rotated her heavily muscled shoulders, turning her colossal torso entirely toward the heavily reinforced wooden planter box she had filled just hours before the attack. She lowered her gigantic frame until her heavy leather knee pads hit the wet stone floor with a dull thud, bringing her fierce eyes directly level with the dark earth. The rare, crimson-veined orchid stood completely unharmed in the exact center of the deep dirt, its delicate red vines wrapped securely around a small wooden support stake. The towering warrior extended her right hand forward, her massive wrist locking rigidly into place to stop the trembling of her corded arm muscles. She gently pressed the flat pad of her scarred index finger directly against the edge of the paper-thin crimson petal, applying absolutely zero destructive physical pressure. Silas ceased his sweeping instantly, his pale hands dropping heavily to his sides as he allowed the worn broom handle to fall against his narrow chest. He watched the massive predator silently interacting with the delicate flower, his exhausted eyes tracking the stark visual contrast between her dark clan tattoos and the vibrant red bloom. Risha traced the curved edge of the fragile petal, her heavy breathing slowing to a deep, controlled exhale that barely disturbed the cold air. She did not crush the tiny stem, nor did she snap the green leaves. Her lethal hands displayed the exact restraint necessary to physically nurture defenseless life. The severe white scars cutting cleanly across her broad back told the brutal history of a warrior violently broken and cast out by her superstitious people. Yet, anchored firmly within the safe dirt of the ruined greenhouse, the massive berserker had completely rooted herself into a new, entirely peaceful existence. Silas stepped slowly forward, his wet leather boots making a soft sound against the damp stone floor, intentionally signaling his physical approach to the kneeling behemoth. He stopped mere inches from her towering shoulder, his bruised hands reaching out to gently adjust the small wooden stake supporting the weight of the crimson flower. Risha did not pull her massive hand away, allowing his fragile fingers to work seamlessly right beside her thick knuckles in the cold morning light. The violently torn roots of the massive warrior and the fragile botanist had been forcefully repotted into the exact same broken soil, forcing them to grow significantly stronger together to survive. If this story about finding unexpected family and choosing mercy over traditions warmed your heart, please subscribe to the channel for more cozy fantasy tales. Join us every week for new stories where true growth, unbreakable loyalty, and deep love always require immense patience and a gentle touch.